I'm Samantha Rose Mandeles, and I serve on the board of Ezra Uganda Assistance, an all-volunteer nonprofit organization that supports the Jewish community of Namutumba, Uganda, and don't encourage this.
From Oxford, Ohio, just steps away from the world-famous Miami University campus. Right outside the city of Cincinnati, you're listening to Don't Encourage This. I'm your host, Mark Von Bullock. I am a minister in the Presbyterian Church USA, and this podcast is a series of conversations with creatives, artists, and interfaith voices. My guest this episode is Samantha Mandeles. Sam has been a contributor for Newsweek, the Jewish News Syndicate, and a number of other publications, and she was also showcased in the documentary The J Street Challenge, where she discusses the complexities of Middle Eastern politics and media representation. Samantha is a passionate photographer. Her images are the subject of an exhibition entitled The Abayudaya, Portrait of an African Jewish Community, which captures the lives of a Jewish community in Namutumba, Uganda. This project involved delivering a Torah scroll to the Abayudaya community, and her story is fascinating. In addition to being a vocal advocate for combating anti-Semitism, Sam is a bit of a Renaissance woman. Her professional work spans counterterrorism research, journalism, and documentary photography. She received her master's degree from Reichman University in Israel and a bachelor's in bioarchaeology and Middle Eastern studies from Hampshire College. We'll talk a little bit this episode about how these two areas of study, bioarchaeology and counterterrorism, have informed her worldview. I first met Sam at a presentation that she recently gave at the Interfaith Center of Miami University here in Oxford, where she offered a glimpse at some of the images in the exhibition. In 2025, Sam joins the board of directors at the Interfaith Center, and I was very interested in how her work intersects with interfaith dialogue. In this episode, Sam and I talk a little bit about some of the ways that the Christian community and the Jewish community think and talk about God. In what ways are they similar? In what ways are they unique? Sam brings a very insightful theological mind to the conversation, and I wanted to hear more about her amazing journey to Uganda to deliver a Torah to the Abayudaya and the images that tell the story of this African Jewish community. I was very excited to welcome Sam as my guest on this episode of the podcast. As you listen to our interview, please forgive the way my voice sounds. We recorded this conversation over Zoom just before Easter weekend during Holy Week. I was getting over a very nasty case of laryngitis, so I apologize for the way my voice sounds. But it's a fascinating conversation and an even more fascinating story. Let's talk to Samantha Mandeles. But I just like to let people know. So anyway, that's the spiel. That's the whole.
Fantastic. It's a good spiel. And I appreciate that you're using some Yiddish there.
I hope that's not cultural appropriation. I love dropping Yiddish in every now and then, but I sometimes worry. I'm like, I hope I'm not like.
No. I personally, I have absolutely no problem with it whatsoever. It's always gratifying to me when non-Jews are aware of the language and terms and nomenclature and all of these things that were originally Jewish, because, I don't know, like, this sounds corny, but it makes me feel seen,
Oh, good. Oh, well, that makes me happy.
I think it's so sweet. Growing up, I didn't always know that a particular term was Yiddish. It was just said in my house, and I grew up with it, and I assumed it was English. I went to a Jewish school, preschool, through the end of 8th grade. So I was learning to read Hebrew and write Hebrew and speak Hebrew and Yiddish and, all these things. And so I first went to a public school in 9th grade. I was 14. And I remember it was probably freshman or sophomore year. We had these staggered lunch schedules, and I said something to one of my friends. I was with a group of friends in between classes, and it was probably 10 in the morning, and I was like, oh my gosh, I don't think I can make it until lunch without a Vorspeise. And my friends were like, excuse me? Bless you. And I'm like, what do you mean? Like, I Vorspeise. Like, I'm like, I need a Vorspeise. And they were like, that is not a word. I'm like, what do you get? It's a Vorspeise. And
It is
I
a
didn't,
word. It's a Yiddish
it is
word.
a word. It's just not English.
I love it.
And I had no idea so Vorspeise is like an appetizer. It's a pre-meal snack. And I had no idea that it was not a word that everybody knew. Like there were a number of occasions like that through high school, which, it was just like all of these Yiddish and Hebrew words that I grew up with.
I love that.
The Vorspeise one really sticks in my mind because they were so shocked. They were like, "What is that?" Yeah, and they were like, "What are you saying? Are you having a stroke? Like, what are you?" Yeah. So it was just so funny.
You and I first met at an event at the Interfaith Center at Miami here in Oxford, Ohio. You were giving a wonderful presentation, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But you and I were chatting. I can't remember if it was before your presentation or maybe after the presentation.
I don't know. I blacked out.
That's okay. There's an author named Barbara Brown Taylor. She coined this term that I really like called holy envy. And holy envy refers to when someone of faith sees an aspect of another faith that isn't theirs, and they have a real love and affection and almost an envy of that. And it usually is something about either their values or their principles or maybe a spiritual practice. And so over the years, we were talking about, I like to drop Yiddish into my speech from time to time. I have a bit of holy envy for Jewishness. There's so much about Judaism that I love and have affection for. But one bit of holy envy that I have, and you and I talked about this, I feel like there is a comfort and a willingness in Judaism to be really, really honest about some of the hard questions in our faith, be willing to debate, even to critique to some extent some of the stories contained in our respective holy texts, and really wrestle with difficult questions that they raise. I think Christians like to wrestle with difficult questions, but I think in Jewishness, there's a real normalization of arguing, debating, and sometimes even with God. And I wish that Christians had a little bit more of that, because I think there's something really good and faithful and healthy about that. And I wanted to ask you, do you think that's a fair observation to make when looking at Judaism?
Oh, yeah, totally. 100%. I think in many ways that's almost at the very core of what Jewishness is. Our third patriarch, started his life as Yaakov, Jacob. The Torah recounts this story that he ends up wrestling with an angel. He doesn't know it's an angel at the time, but he wrestles with this angel, and once he does that, God renames him Israel, which literally means one who's wrestled with God. And it is from Israel, we are Bnei Israel, we're the children of Israel. That's our entire story. That's our whole lineage right there in one passage. That spirit has carried forward. And you see it also with the other patriarchs, for instance, with Abraham, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham is literally bargaining with God, almost as if God is, I don't want to say an equal, but God is listening. And Abraham is saying, okay, he's testing God's limits. He's saying, okay, well, how many people will it take? How many good people will it take for you to spare the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah? And interestingly, like Abraham is depicted as having almost more mercy than God in that story, and almost, convincing God to show more mercy than God was originally going to show. One of the best examples is Moses.
I was just going to ask about Moses.
Moshe is very reluctant to take on the mantle of a prophet. He says, but I can't speak very well. I have this stutter. They're not going to listen to me. He kind of debates with God about whether or not he's qualified for quite a while. Moshe is never depicted as sort of being a perfect human.
No, he's not.
He's through the end of his life, he's depicted as contradicting God and arguing with God and sometimes flouting his directions. And
as we all do.
Right? And yet, I think it's Maimonides who talks about how the 13 principles of Jewish faith include that Moses, is like there's not a prophet that is equal to him. He is sort of
Mm,
the most important prophet in our history. If there's something so beautiful about that, that he's not portrayed ever as perfect and unattainable. He's quite relatable in a
yeah,
lot of ways. In that he debates, he argues, he second guesses, he worries, he wonders. He doesn't have perfect faith.
right.
In more modern times, you find that spirit coming out during and post-Holocaust era,
Yeah. Oh
um,
boy.
where you see, writers like Elie Wiesel,
Yeah.
of blessed memory. He wonders, how could our God do this to us? And, what does this mean? And, expressing anger towards God very publicly. And I
Yeah.
think even though maybe it might not feel this way to Jewish folks who experienced and survived the horrors of the Shoah, the Holocaust, in a way, expressing that anger towards God and even the disbelief that it wrought and the frustration, it almost sort of reinforces their Jewishness. In some way, they are embodying that Jewish spirit of rebelliousness, of arguing, of debating, of questioning,
Yeah.
always questioning. So, yeah, definitely. I think it's a huge part of what Jewishness is.
You mentioned Moses a minute ago. There's a story, I think it's in Exodus 32. Moses and the Israelites have been out wandering in the wilderness for ages and ages, and the Israelites have been grumbling, and God is getting frustrated with all their shenanigans.
And
And
they're kvetching.
yeah,
That's
kvetching, yes.
that's the Yiddish. They're
To use a
kvetching, of
little
course.
Yiddish, God and Moses have a little staff meeting. I'm going to have to paraphrase here because I don't have it in front of me. But God basically says, Moses, I've had it. Enough is enough. We're going to wipe them all out. You and I are going to start over. We'll start our own group, you and me, and we're going to just hit the reset button and,
Right,
kill them all, blah, 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 blah. Which is, and Moses is understandably disturbed by this and is trying to talk God down off the ledge and saying,
right.
no, God, you can't do that. Or, remember your covenant. Remember this, that, and the other. And God's like, no, I've made up my mind. I think Moses actually says, if they hear about this back in Egypt, if Pharaoh finds out after you did all those plagues showing him up, that's gonna, and then it all fell apart out here in the desert. Then it's not exactly a good look. I'm paraphrasing. Some of this is
I
lost.
love that. I love
It's lost
that.
in the translation.
Is that before or after the golden calf episode?
That's an excellent question. I am not sure, but there's
Okay.
a specific verse in there. And I must say to the listeners, I'm being a little comedic here. This is not, it's not,
No,
but
yeah.
there's a specific verse and it says, God changed his mind
Mm-hmm.
after, and I remember when I first read that in seminary, I was like, what? Because
Yeah.
Christians we're not often taught to think about God like that. We're often taught to think of God as this sort of disembodied, omnipotent, God is good all the time, all the time God is good.
Mm-hmm.
But we also have this conception of a personal God, of a relational God. And if there's not some back and forth in the relation, then is it even a real relationship? You know what I mean? So
Right.
I look at, and also this is fundamentally a Jewish story. So I have holy envy for that aspect of Jewishness because I just find it so fascinating and so rich and more three-dimensional than some of the ways that we tend to think about this stuff.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I made it myself, Um,
You made Judaism, as we know.
Yes, it was all me, really. No, but it's always so nice to hear that kind of thing because, I think sometimes in university towns and in larger cities and maybe in less rural enclaves of the United States, we forget that we aren't loved everywhere,
Right.
and really there's no place like the United States besides Israel for Jews. There has been considerable anti-Semitism and still is,
Sure.
but in comparison to really every other place outside of Israel in the world, American Jews have been very fortunate. And so it's easy to forget, that, still most of the world, I think, doesn't love us.
Right,
So,
right.
so it's really, it's deeply appreciated for sure.
Wow. Those are warm sentiments. For those listeners playing the home game, I peeked at my Bible. That story I just mentioned is right after the golden calf episode.
Okay.
It's right after. In fact, I think it's probably fair to say the golden calf is what sets God off.
Hmm.
So I'm glad you brought that up.
You know what's so interesting about that is that at the beginning of I guess when Moses discovers the golden calf, he's the one who is completely incensed.
Yeah.
Right? Like he throws the first iteration of Alutzot Abrit, the tablets of the covenant.
Yes.
He throws them and shatters them. I mean, I don't know how this relates to your question, but I think it's interesting that he then calms down and has to calm God.
Right.
Which is, very interesting dynamic. I could probably learn from Moses about breathing exercises. I bet he did some in that moment.
Couldn't we all?
Yeah.
Sam, you were talking about your upbringing just a moment ago. I wanted to ask, I was curious, how did your upbringing shape your connection to Judaism?
Oh, extremely deeply. Both of my parents are Jewish. We all did one of those 23andMe sort of tests. My mother's results were like 98.5% Ashkenazi Jewish.
Oh, wow.
And my father's was like only a few points behind her. So we were very Eastern European. And my father is what's called a Kohen, which means that he is a descendant and part of the priestly class. And you can only be a Kohen if you're like, women are designated Bat Kohen, like daughter of the Kohen. So, but you really can only pass down the Kohen honorific if you're male, but you can only be a Kohen if you have a Jewish mother, of course.
I see.
Judaism is matrilineal. So in that way, we know that for generations and generations and generations going back, my family has been pretty much 100%. They put me in, I believe I started preschool at age 2, and the preschool was at the synagogue in Northern Virginia, at which they were members. In the summers for many years, my brother and I went to day camp run by Chabad, which is a sect of Orthodox Judaism.
Okay.
And they ran Camp Gan Israel, which means Garden of Israel. And for short, we called it Camp Gan Izzy. And, it was a regular camp, but we prayed, in the morning, we said the blessing before bread, before eating, we did the blessing after the meal, it was a Jewish camp. So I learned kind of a lot of the practices and traditions of sort of the three main, I guess you could say, levels of religiosity.
Sure.
In the US. And then, that in Jewish day school, we spent half of the day doing general studies, math, science, reading. And then the other half of the day was all Hebrew, learning Torah, learning, Talmud, learning Jewish history. So, and that was, 9 years. It was definitely formative, and I think contributes to my understanding of Jewish faith and theology. And then, of course, after high school, I went to Israel for a year. And then I ended up working for many years in the Jewish nonprofit world. I think very deeply it has impacted my understanding of Jewishness. It emphasized the importance of study to Jewishness, and it emphasized the importance really of knowing who and what I am. Being proud, yes, of being an American. And I love being an American, and I'm very patriotic, and I love this country, flaws and all.
I do too.
But also, I'm not only an American, I'm distinct. I'm a Jew. We have our own culture, we have our own traditions,
Absolutely.
and the most important thing I think my Jewish upbringing gave me was pride.
Oh,
Yeah, like I'm very, very proud to be a Jew.
I love
And
that.
I'm very proud of Jewishness. I'm very proud of Judaism. I'm very proud of Jews in general. Yeah, we argue a lot, we complain, we're kind of a pain in the butt, but I love my people. Yeah, that's really the main thing. That was a roundabout way of getting there, but I got there in the
No,
end.
I love it. I love it. I love it. Sam, I wanted to ask you a little bit about your background. In my extensive dossier of research here, you studied bioarchaeology and counterterrorism, two seemingly pretty different fields. I wanted to ask you, how did you come into these areas of study, and how have they influenced your work and your worldview?
Until I went to Israel after high school, I was pretty convinced that I wanted to be an artist and maybe work in show business. One of the things that I did in Israel, I did an archaeological conservation internship at Masada, which is one of Israel's most famous archaeological sites. It's in the Judean desert and was excavated first by Yigael Yadin, sort of Israel's most famous archaeologist. And it is the site of, well, a number of interesting events in history. But for Jews, the most momentous was in the year 73, I believe, as recounted by the Jewish historian Josephus Flavius. 967 Jews who had holed up on top of this mountain using previously constructed buildings decades earlier. Herod had used as a sort of a vacation palace. So he constructed this vacation palace on top of this mountain.
That's where I put my vacation palaces. I usually find
Yeah,
a good mountaintop to put them.
naturally, and in the middle of the desert. And um, the Roman occupant, there was a rebellion that broke out in the year 66. And so in the year, I believe it was the year 70, when finally the Romans conquered Jerusalem, there was this band of approximately 960 Jewish, in English, they're called zealots, but they were referred to as the Sikari. They fled Jerusalem to Masada, which is about an hour and a half south of Jerusalem. And they holed up there for several years while the Romans and General Titus and his 10th Legion laid siege. The story is that finally, when the Romans alighted on top of the mountain, they found all of the Jewish residents of this mountain. So, 262 people, I believe, had committed suicide on top of the mountain, burned all of their grain out in the open for the Romans to see. And according to Josephus Flavius, 2 women and 3 children hid in one of the cisterns. And when the Romans got to the top of the mountain, they emerged to tell the Romans what happened. But everybody else committed suicide. And, as a way of saying to the Romans, we will not be conquered by you. We'd sooner die than give up our sovereignty as Jews. And that was sort of the end of the occupation of the mountain, archaeologically speaking, until the Byzantines came, some Byzantine monks, and built some modest churches on top of the mountain and came to, live in solitude. I was working there as an intern, learning all about the mountain and doing archaeological conservation work, cleaning the mosaics, injecting plaster into crumbling pieces of frescoes. And I thought, oh, okay. So I ended up in college studying Middle East and archaeology, and archaeology became bioarchaeology and forensic anthropology. So really interested in the archaeology of human remains. I did my field school in Greece one summer. I excavated at Archaea Corinthos, ancient Corinth. It was wonderful. In college, I went to a very small liberal arts school. I wrote this big kind of senior paper on what political warfare looks like, psychological warfare. The concept of persuasive definitions written about by Charles Leslie Stevenson. I used the work of actually my father's academic mentor, the late Martin Landau, who was a brilliant scholar at Indiana University. And that kind of propelled me into working for Jewish nonprofits, focusing on doing research on the Middle East and Israel and looking at media portrayals of Israel around the world. I spent 5 years after college doing that and then ended up studying counterterrorism in Israel. And if you're going to study counterterrorism, there's really no better place than Israel. I do open source intelligence in relation to counter-extremism, counterterrorism, researching anti-Semitic organizations, researching terror front groups, looking at money trails, all of that stuff.
You are also a very gifted photographer, and your photographs are the subject of an exhibit called the Abayudaya, Portrait of an African Jewish Community. Please pardon my laryngitis-ridden Southern accent there, but
totally okay. I don't know many folks in the South who are taught to speak Luganda, so
I wonder if you could tell us about the Abayudaya. First of all, who are they? And secondly, how did you first become aware of them?
So Abayudaya it's a Luganda word that means people of Judah. And Luganda is it's sort of the lingua franca of kind of Eastern Uganda. Although the people who live there often speak up to 5 or 6 languages, including Luganda, Lusoga, Lugwere, Lusiki, and even sometimes Swahili. But Luganda is kind of the most common. The Abayudaya are essentially Eastern Ugandan and actually just in general Ugandan Jews. Their story is fascinating. They are descended both genetically and I suppose theologically from a convert to Judaism. His name was Seme Kakungulu. And he was a Bantu warlord in Uganda in the 19th century. And the British, when the British were still trying to make inroads into the country, the British were fighting Muslim forces that were also trying to conquer parts of that territory. And they essentially conscripted Kakungulu and said, look, we know that you have an army. We know that you have a lot of influence here. If you help us defeat the Muslim forces, we will sort of make you leader of, this particular area. Kakungulu did, in fact, aid the British in their military efforts to conquer areas of Uganda. The story gets a little bit dicey because I think first there's not been a huge amount of scholarship on this particular piece of Kakungulu's life and the history of that region. And then also a lot of the scholarship that exists is in Swahili and has not been translated into English. All this is to say that my sources are limited or were limited at the time that I was doing research into Kakungulu. And I think that there's probably more out there, and there's, probably some great primary source material in some archive somewhere in Kampala. In any case, the basic story is that the British then neglected to do what they had promised for Kakungulu. So he took his followers and the Swahili Bible that the British had given him in an attempt to convert him to Protestantism. And he kind of created this separatist community at the base of Mount Elgon in an area that is today known as the city of Mbale. He circumcised himself and his sons. he decided he was basically dispensing with the Christian sections of the Bible and embracing the Jewish parts. In practice, Kakungulu's faith evolved through his life, and especially at the beginning, he really kind of merged aspects of the Jewish faith with Maliki religion, with Christian science, with sort of local animist beliefs. But in the end, Kakungulu's followers continued the Jewish practices with which he raised them until his death. And then in the 1920s or 30s, it's possible even earlier, the sources are a little bit. What the legend is that some Jew who was probably employed by the British on engineering projects in Uganda and was from Europe somewhere, came upon the community and expanded their understanding of Jewishness in that he gave them sort of the whole Jewish Bible, the Tanakh, and explained customs such as kashrut, keeping kosher, and elaborated on halakha, Jewish law, and essentially introduced the community to rabbinic Judaism. And it was from there that the community evolved to sort of practice something that is much more akin to what we know as Judaism today.
Sure.
And it kept growing and growing. And of course, there was a bit of a blip in 1970 through 1979 when Idi Amin, the deeply anti-Semitic dictator, rose to power and persecuted the community to the point that it was mostly decimated.
Mm-hmm.
It has since then been rebuilt thanks to the efforts of the late Rabbi Eri, the spiritual leader of the community in the Namutumba area, very rural eastern Uganda, which is where I spent some time. And then after Rabbi Eri, the efforts of Gershom Suzomu, who is a rabbi based in the Abayudaya headquarters of Mbale, who has really raised the profile of the Abayudaya community. He even served in Uganda's parliament for a term.
Oh, wow.
Through the years, Jewish folks have visited the community. In the 1960s, Aryeh Oded, an Israeli diplomat and scholar, came to the community. He wrote several books on his relationship with the community. He introduced the community to sort of modern Israel. In 2002, I believe, a number of conservative rabbis from the United States came to the Mbale, I believe, and converted formally several hundred members of the Abayudaya community. And there have been more conversions since then. Today, the community, it lives a pious lifestyle. They keep kosher as much as they can. They celebrate all of the Jewish holidays as much as they can. They study Hebrew and Jewish history as much as they can. They really do their best. And that's not easy. It's not easy to be Jewish at the best of times, but to be Jewish in rural eastern Uganda with no plumbing and no electricity, that's a pretty tough ask. But they, I know that they're Jews because they're stubborn about it. They're very persistent, and they really do their best with what little they have. Personally, I have always been interested in Jewish communities around the world, most particularly African Jewry.
Yeah.
When I was a young girl, nowadays, when Jewish girls of Reform or conservative persuasion reach the ages of 12, 13, they have a bat mitzvah. So it's the female version of a bar mitzvah, which essentially it's a ceremony that means, you are now an adult and you are required to, follow all of the tenets of Jewish law. You're no longer exempt from fasting on Yom Kippur, for instance. It's a ceremony where, the student reads the Torah. And for a lot of American Jews, that means that the student does what's called a tzedakah project.
Okay.
Tzedakah, it's often incorrectly translated as charity. What it really is giving, but it's not optional. It's mandatory giving. And it's something that all Jews are obligated to do. As a bat mitzvah, I chose for my tzedakah project with my bat mitzvah to work with the Ethiopian Jewish community, which of course was many of them in the 1980s and 1990s, as Ethiopia and Eritrea were going through a bloody civil war. Many of them, about 35,000, were airlifted to Israel and made citizens and integrated into the country. There are still some Ethiopian and Eritrean Jews in Ethiopia, but the community is very, very small. They were deeply imperiled during the time of the airlifts, and they would have been slaughtered if Israel had not picked them up and taken them to Israel. And that they always fascinated me. So I worked with this organization called the North American Conference on Ethiopian Jewry. And I did my best to, I researched the community, and I gave several presentations at my school, at my synagogue, and I think at a few other places around Northern Virginia about the Ethiopian Jewish community. And then I collected donated school supplies, which my family and I then brought to Israel and delivered to an Ethiopian Jewish community that was, I believe, living in an absorption center. So,
Oh, wow.
sort of still, still not very much money, not a wealthy community, and they were in dire need of things like school supplies.
Yeah.
So we collected a bunch and brought them over. So I've always been interested and fascinated by this idea that Jews are not a race unto ourselves. We are a culture.
Yes.
We are, of course, a religion. We are an ethnicity. We are a people, but we're not a race necessarily. And so Jews can be of different race and they can look different, but we're still Jews. And I love that about the Abayudaya. So my mom had joined the board of this organization, whom she met the founder because she decided a few years ago she wanted to get ordained herself as a cantor. And so one of her teachers, Rabbi Layla, founded the organization because one of the students who was taking the ordination classes online was the upcoming spiritual leader of the Jewish village in Namutumba in Uganda. And he was having a lot of trouble paying for his school fees and accessing the internet. And so Rabbi Layla formed this small nonprofit just to raise the funds and the assistance that Rabbi Shadrach needed to actually become a rabbi. And it just snowballed. We support and partner with the whole village, and the organization is called Ezra Uganda Assistance. And, we've done things like we vaccinated the entire village against hepatitis C.
Oh, nice.
Dozens and dozens of mosquito nets and solar panels. We funded the building of a granary so that in times of famine or drought, the community has, a communal area where they can put food collected in times of surplus and hopefully none of them go hungry. And then, of course, we funded the building of the community's synagogue. Prior to the synagogue being built, they were worshiping, kind of in a tiny mud hut with thatched roof. And some of them were worshiping under this, ratty blue tarp on sticks. We provided the funding and they built the synagogue with their own hands. They made the bricks with the mud from the ground. They put the bricks together. They really did it themselves. I was able, in December of 2021, there was a synagogue in Hamilton, New Jersey that was unfortunately closing its doors and had a Torah to donate.
I was going to ask you about this story. I'm glad you're bringing it up.
Oh yeah. I mean, this was a crazy journey. This Torah, I believe, was created in the 1930s. It was about 45 pounds. It was kosher, and the community had no kosher Torah.
For those of us who are not familiar, what does that mean that a Torah is kosher? What do you mean by that?
Very good question. And I always forget that not every person knows this. So you know how in Jewish law, there are certain foods that are kosher and non-kosher. Like
Yes.
We're allowed to eat and we're not allowed to eat. And a lot of that, there's all kinds of variables. What the animal is, how the animal is slaughtered, how the animal is processed, and is the animal blessed at the correct time, how the animal is stored. All of those things impact what is kosher and what's not. A Torah is made from animal products.
Oh, that's right.
So there are a number of variables that also determine whether or not a Torah is kosher. And the same is true of other sacred scrolls, such as the scroll that goes into a mezuzah, the little case that you often see sitting on the door jambs in Jewish homes, which holds a parchment with the Shema, the most important prayer in Judaism, to protect the house. It's the same for the text, the scrolls that go inside tefillin, the phylacteries that Orthodox Jewish men often wear around their arms and on their heads when praying. So these sacred scrolls, they're all made of animal products. So this is animal skin. The same rules apply. How the animal is slaughtered, how it is processed, how it's used. Has the skin been harvested correctly? Is it processed correctly? Then the ink also, it has to be made in a very, very specific way. And then finally, there's the writing of the Torah. There's all these rules that go into it. Like, there are some mistakes that you can scrape the ink off and keep going. But then if you make a mistake, for instance, it's an actual profession. Like, a Jewish scribe is a profession that has existed for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And if the scribe makes an error in the writing of God's name, the whole thing has to be scrapped.
Oh, wow. The whole Torah.
The whole thing, because you can't erase it. And it has to be disposed of in a certain way. Yeah, there are all these rules. So,
wow.
So a kosher Torah is one in which all of these rules have been followed.
I see.
And none of the ink hasn't flaked off in certain ways, especially the ink that has gone into the writing of the names of God. That has to be pristine in order for the kashrut to remain. That has to be blessed in a certain way. So it takes about a year to produce a kosher Torah.
And so this synagogue in New Jersey, they had one and they were closing. They'd followed all of this exactly.
Yes. Yeah. And the Torah, was nearly 100 years old. And the rabbi there, Rabbi Abby, somehow knew Rabbi Layla. So we agreed to donate this Torah to the Abayudaya. So my mom and I drove from Washington, D.C. to Hamilton, New Jersey. We picked up this Torah, and then
45-pound Torah,
like a large.
When you say we picked up this Torah, you mean you really had to like lift this thing.
Yeah,
Incredible.
It was very large. And I am not a big person. I'm 5'2", dear listeners. So yeah, it's a very large thing. And then we wrapped it in, I would estimate, about 5 pounds of bubble wrap and blankets, and then put the whole thing in this massive duffel bag that had no wheels. So
oh, wow.
Yeah, so I flew. It was a whole thing. Like, we had to call the airlines ahead of time to ask, like, what's the best way to do this? And they wanted to check it, and we were like, no.
Oh, no, you can't check the Torah.
No, we're not checking the Torah.
Oh my God. Could you imagine? I'm just imagining. I'm sorry. I hope this isn't.
Oh, no, not at all.
Like just going out of baggage claim and seeing like that conveyor belt, and all of a sudden it's like the Torah, just like, oh, that would not be a good day.
No. We don't want to subject it to like magnetic, I don't know.
Oh, my Lord.
And actually, I was going to fly, I think it was Brussels. And then like 2 days before, they canceled the flight.
Oh, no.
Like, after everything was arranged. So we had to scramble. We ended up, like, we had to book 2 seats, 1 seat for me and 1 for the Torah. And like, then we had to do it last minute all over again.
Yeah.
With KLM. So I ended up flying from Washington to New York to Amsterdam to Kigali, Rwanda to Entebbe, Uganda. And then it was a 7-hour drive from Entebbe to Namutumba. Yeah. And
did you have to buy a plane ticket for the Torah on each of those flights?
Yeah.
Holy moly.
Yeah. And they still, like, poor KLM, like these poor Dutch flight attendants had absolutely no idea what was happening. Like, this duffel bag was sort of sitting in the seat next to me upright. And they were like, yeah, you have to put that under the seat or in the overhead bin. And I was like, no. I've explained this already 16 times, but let me explain it again. Like, yeah, it was,
I'll
they were
explain
just,
it in Dutch this time.
I wish, but yeah, they had no idea. Like I don't think that
Oh my
they
God.
probably ever encountered anything like it or since. To make it all more interesting, I had injured my foot beforehand, and so I had a giant black plastic boot on my foot.
Oh, Sam.
Arrive in Uganda in late 2021, and they're still doing COVID testing. And the airport in Entebbe, that does not have a facility for people to like do lots of people to have their COVID tested.
Yeah, because we were still maybe not at the height of the pandemic, but still very much in the thick of it.
Oh yeah, like I needed, I needed a bunch of documents showing like, oh, I got I got a test right on this day beforehand,
Yeah.
and then get tested when you arrive. And so they like wheel me out to these tents kind of outside the airport, and it's nighttime and like 90 degrees and humid, and I have this giant duffel bag on my lap in a wheelchair with a boot, and like somebody is like pushing the wheelchair behind me. It was just the most ridiculous.
Oi gewalt.
Oi gewalt, indeed. I might even say oi smear. Like it was but like bringing the community the Torah, like when I finally arrived and they had their first service with the Torah, that was marvelous. It was really just one of the most beautiful experiences. They were incandescent.
Sam, I remember when you gave that presentation at the Interfaith Center here in Ohio, and you showed us some of these photographs, these images that you had taken of this journey of the Abayudaya people. And it really is amazing to take in these images. You observed Shabbat with the Abayudaya, is that right?
You do, yeah. So, I was taking photographs of almost everything, but then on Friday night through Saturday night, camera was off.
Yeah.
It was all off. So we had a Shabbat service without the camera. I'm torn. Half of me wishes that I'd had the camera there to capture it, but the other half of me, there was something very beautiful about it just being the community on their first Shabbat with the Torah, observing the Shabbat rules. It was a really magical, very, very emotional experience.
Yeah.
They're a remarkable group of people. They really are.
Well, Sam, as we said, your photographs have been the subject of this exhibit, the Abayudaya Portrait of an African Jewish Community. What do you hope people will take away from this exhibit and these images?
That's a really good question. I think that the images are important in a political sense because there is this narrative that has become very, very, very prominent over the last half century. The narrative says that Jews are all white, wealthy, and privileged. In some ways, this narrative is a continuation of ancient narratives that associate Jews with money and sneakiness. But the modern iteration of this narrative, its foil on the right says that, Jews are all communists, right? Like this was something that we were seeing in Russia in the 1880s and before and after, the Jews sort of pioneered communism for the destabilization of Russia and beyond. And that was very prominent sort of in the earlier Soviet, but like on the left, you have this idea that, like Jews are not responsible for communism, they're responsible for capitalism, and all of the evils that capitalism has necessarily wrought on the poor, the income inequality. I think some of that narrative is fed by what we might call Farrakhanist ideals, where Louis Farrakhan of the Nation of Islam, deeply anti-Semitic organization, has claimed for decades that Jews organized and drove the transatlantic African slave trade. That kind of ties into the Jews are white and privileged idea.
Sure.
And I think, what people forget is, numerically speaking, a plurality, if not a majority of Jews are people of color. Half of the Jews in Israel are Jews with brown skin.
Yeah.
A full half, if not more. And Jews from North Africa, Jews from Iraq, Jews from Ethiopia, Jews from all over the place. And I think, well, I hope that highlighting this oft forgotten community of faithful and loving and pious Jews who are ethnically, they're ethnically African,
Yeah.
ethnically Bantu for the most part, who have chosen Jewishness. Even in the midst of all of the struggles that Jewishness brings, they have chosen Jewishness, which is remarkable to me. They are brown and they're not white and they're definitely not privileged financially.
No, certainly not.
No, and they live every day in tiny, homes and huts that they build themselves, and they have no plumbing and they have no electricity.
Yeah.
And in order to get water, they hike to the borehole with jerry cans and pump the water themselves and then hike back, even if it's the middle of the day in Uganda, which sits on the equator. So I think that they, can do a lot to counter this really pernicious narrative that Jews are one color and control the money and are all privileged. But I think the Abayudaya can remind other Jews of who and what we are and of the multifaceted nature of Jewishness. It can remind other Jews that, sometimes we forget we are not a race. We are a people, and we're an ethnicity, yes. And that comes with lots and lots of different colors of people of different shapes and sizes. And I think it can remind it helps maybe to remind ourselves that maybe what makes a person a Jew is, yes, perhaps being born to a Jewish family, perhaps, taking a halachically compliant conversion, perhaps celebrating Shabbat, but also what makes a Jew and what maybe really makes a Jew is voluntary identification with world Jewry, with our community, with our Torah, with one another, with Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, with all of our history, engagement with our history, and all of the challenges that we've seen, but sort of choosing one another and choosing the covenant that we have with God and the obligations and requirements that brings, even if, you're not so strict and you don't follow it all the time, but really choosing to be a part of that and a part of this nation, a part of this Jewish people every day. And it is a choice. The fact that they choose Jewishness and they choose Jews in the face of everything that they deal with, it's certainly inspiring to me. And I really hope that it could be inspiring to other Jews, especially, and to people in general, as sort of a wider story of perseverance and spirit and pride and making life what you want it to be instead of what it gives you.
Samantha Mandeles serves on the board of directors of Ezra Uganda Assistance, which is a 501c3 nonprofit that supports the Abayudaya community of Namutumba. The exhibit is called The Abayudaya Portrait of an African Jewish Community. Sam, this has been such a joy. I'm so grateful and thankful that you've shared some of your time with us. And where can folks connect with the work that you're doing if they'd like to learn more?
The website is ezrauganda.org. So Ezra, which means help in Hebrew, Ezra is EZRA, Uganda, all one word, .org. Thank you so much, Mark. This was really wonderful and such a privilege, and anytime, truly.
That's going to just about wrap it up for this episode of Don't Encourage This. My very deep thanks again to Samantha Mandeles for joining us on the program. If you'd like to hear more conversations like this, Don't Encourage This is available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, whichever platforms you like to get your podcasts out of the thing. But of course, you probably knew that already because you're doing that right now. And of course, don't forget it's also on YouTube. If you'd like to contact the program, you can drop us a line at don'tencouragethis@gmail.com. From Oxford, Ohio, I'm Mark Von Bullock. Thanks again.